Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Emily Hiles, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Corporal Zach Boughton. This evening, we are honoured to welcome Commander Holukauka Lakai, Component Commander Navy, His Majesty's Armed Forces of Tonga, Rear Admiral Christopher Smith, Deputy Chief of Navy Australia, and their accompanying delegations. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria, and RSL Queensland who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by visitors to the memorial and students on behalf of Sydney Adventist School, Auburn, New South Wales. If you're able, please stand and join in singing the National Anthem. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 103,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, flowers of the forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Bombardier Ernest Stanley Potter. Ernest Potter was born in Mackay, Queensland on the 20th of January 1909, the son of Andrew and Ellen Porter. Little is known of his early life. By the advent of the Second World War, he was working as an accountant and had married Hilda Marie Lee. Ernest Porter enlisted in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force at Kelvin Grove on the 23rd of July 1940, joining the newly established 2nd 10th Field Regiment. From October to December, the men of the regiment conducted field manoeuvres and trained with 18-pounder guns from the First World War. Porter showed potential, and in September was promoted to acting bombardier. After a period of leave in January 1941, in February, Porter and his comrades began moving from Red Bank Camp to the South Brisbane railway station to travel by train to Sydney. They arrived in Circular Quay the next day. There they boarded the Queen Mary, which had been converted from a passenger ship to a troop ship. During the journey to Singapore, Porter was admitted to the ship's hospital with dermatitis. Arriving a little over a fortnight later, he finished his treatment and recuperation on the island after being transferred to a military hospital. Porter was promoted to bombardier on the 8th of May 1941 and attended training schools in Malaya in August and September. With Imperial Japan launching simultaneous surprise attacks on the United States and the British Empire in early December 1941, Australian concerns about war in the Pacific peaked. In early January 1942, Porter's 2nd 10th Field Regiment was re-equipped with 25-pounders. 4 days later, its position was bombed and strafed for the first time by Japanese aircraft. Japanese troops quickly advanced through Malaya and by January had entered Johor on the mainland facing Singapore Island. The regiment first went into action on the 21st of January, bringing down artillery fire on Japanese troops along the Mersing and Dao Road. This allowed a platoon that had been cut off from the 2nd 20th Battalion to escape. The unit was in action from then on, firing on targets while gradually withdrawing to Singapore Island. The last of the regiment's troops crossed the causeway from mainland to Singapore on the 30th of January. The causeway was demolished the next morning. The main Japanese assault on Singapore began on the 8th of February, crossing the Johor Strait in barges. By midday the next day, the Japanese had broken through. There was continual heavy fighting, and although it had been shelled and bombarded with air attack, batteries of Porter's unit fired up to 800 shells and sank 30 sampans carrying Japanese troops. Commonwealth troops withdrew to the city, forming a defensive perimeter. The 2nd 10th remained in action, firing 2,100 rounds on Bukit Timah village. The next day, the regiment moved to Tanglen Golf Course, where it came under heavy enemy artillery fire and airstrikes. The regiment ceased firing on the 14th of February, and the next day, the garrison surrendered. Porter was initially imprisoned in the sprawling Changi prison of war camp. While there, he was sent to an inmate-run hospital, suffering from a large parasitic roundworm. In April 1943, Porter was allocated to F Force, one of the last Labor forces to leave Singapore, consisting of 3,662 Australians and 3,400 British forces. F Force's hardships began when they were sent to Thailand by train, packed into suffocating metal railway tracks with little food and water. On reaching Ban Pong in Thailand, the prisoners were marched over 300 kilometres to half a dozen camps, progressing towards the Burma border. To avoid the heat, which was at its most intense in April, the prisoners marched at night for as much as 12 to 15 hours. When the monsoonal rains began in May, paths became impossibly slippery and treacherous. Many of the men collapsed and had to drop out. The bulk of F-Force arrived utterly exhausted in mid-May at remote and primitive camps, where acute supply problems aggravated widespread outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, malaria, beriberi, and diarrhea. Many of the men were unwell even before they left. Isolated in upcountry Thailand, remote from food and medical supplies, and drenched by monsoonal rains, a third of the Australians and almost two-thirds of the British prisoners died. Ernest Porter died of cholera on the 27th of May, 1943. He was 34 years old. Today, his remains lie buried at Tan Bayo Zayat's war ceremony under the inscription, "For Freedom, Ever Remembered." His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, amongst the 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Bombardier Ernest Stanley Porter, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of our Director and staff, we thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support of the Memorials Development Project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening.